In 1969, a group of astronauts changed the world. They walked on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
In 1972, our journey ended. We've never been back. 2010 begins a year of change. Private companies are working on next-generation spaceships. Governments are looking to go back to the moon and on to Mars. It's time to look up and dream again. It's time to push humans into the cosmos. It's time to educate and engage the planet. It's time for Spacevidcast.
This is Spacevidcast Live 325 for Friday, July 30th, 2010. My name is Benjamin Higginbotham. With me as usual is a beautiful, lovely, wonderful, and talented Carrie Ann Higginbotham.
I'm unusual.
She is slightly unusual.
I didn't say usual.
We are your Spacevidcasters. We have got an action-packed episode for you tonight. It's going to be really, really cool. And before we get into our guest, I did want to mention a couple of really cool things. We wanted to thank the Space Frontier Foundation for the New Space 20 space. Oh no, I forgot what the word is for.
Really?
Yeah, it's the best presentation of space. There we go.
And we're doing a great job right now.
We're doing something that we got at New Space.
They gave us an award for this, people.
Apparently. For New Space 2010. And you can watch almost all of the clips from New Space 2010 on spacevidcast.com right now by going to spacevidcast.com/newspace/2010. With that, as you guys know, we're huge advocates for next generation space travel. And that means that we have to do something different than what we've been doing for the last 40 years. And that starts with propulsion. One of the things that we've been doing forever and a day is chemical rockets. And while chemical rockets are cool, chemical rockets got us to the moon, they're not exactly a sustainable method of space. Tonight's guest is the author of The Nuclear Rocket, and his name is James Dewar. James, welcome to Spacevidcast. Let's get the 900 million pound gorilla out of the room here first. And that is, when you say a nuclear rocket, the first thing you think of is radiation and the fallout that's going to happen from launching a nuclear rocket. What's the realism behind the radiation there?
Well, radiation has been, is now, and will be a fact of life for all of us. As you and I sit here, we are getting radiation coming from the depths of space, and it's piercing through our body. As you also sit there, you have radiation inside your body, which is radiating out. So as you and your wife sleep, you are, in essence, irradiating each other. It's just a fact of life, and we just have to get used to it. Now, in my first book on the nuclear rocket program, which was called To the End of the Solar System, and there still are some copies with Apogee Press, I had an entire annex dealing with radiation and the environment. And the bottom line is there were about 20 tests done with hot systems, and 19 of them vented a radioactive plume to the environment. Now, in 1974, after the program was killed by President Nixon, the EPA did a wrap-up study of the effluents, and they said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the quote is in either of my two books, they said the program was conducted in a credible manner, and that reflected favorably on both NASA and the AEC, which were the two agencies jointly running the program. They also noted that all releases of radioactivity were below applicable guidelines. Now, there was one test which was not, or which did not give off any radiation, and that was the nuclear furnace test. That was the last one tested in 1972 or 71, and that had what's known as a scrubber. So you had your core here, and you had your nozzle here, and at the base of the nozzle, you basically had some very high-pressure fire hoses, and they blasted a stream of water onto that hot plume and cooled it down so that everything condensed. Then all they did was they filtered out the radioactive gases, and they trapped those. And with the hydrogen gas, that was just vented off to the environment. Now, in terms of using a nuclear rocket in space, you have to bear in mind that there are two major types of radiation that come off: neutrons and gamma rays, and these are the most damaging to humans. But the point is, once you are up above the Earth's atmosphere, you don't have something called air scattering. So that means as the neutrons and the gammas come off the engine, they just fly straight off into space. So the bottom line here is you put your engine at the rear and your astronauts as far forward as possible, then you just let the tanks absorb whatever radiation there might be coming off. So basically, it's not a problem. It's something that good scientists and engineers can handle. Now, to further back up that point, we have had nuke subs sailing in an equally harsh environment since 1954.
That's a good point.
And you had seamen living on board 24/7 and sometimes 365, and they are not glowing in the dark. So the bottom line here is, if you have a well-run program with good people doing the managing, you can make your radiation exposures virtually nil. Now, I want to further emphasize this point, that there were 3 deaths that you can link to the nuclear rocket program, or that I was able to link. The first one happened in 1957 or 58, when one of the founders of the program was driving from Camp Mercury at the test site out to Jackass Flats, where they did the testing, and he crashed and was killed. Now, there was no traffic, and it was in bright daylight, and all that people can say is he just fell asleep at the wheel. The second death occurred at Jackass Flats, where a worker was told to go burn some classified tapes. So he took him out to a gully, and he poured 5 gallons of gas on him. Then he says, well, geez, I don't have enough gas. And he went and got another 5 gallons and poured that on it. Then he struck a match.
Awesome.
Well,
And the third casualty was at Westinghouse, where a worker on the nuclear rocket program, for some reason, entered a tank that was filled with nitrogen, and he was asphyxiated. No one knows why he did it, and it had nothing to do with the program, but since he was listed as a worker on the nuclear rocket, his death was labeled as caused by it.
Of course.
now, when I guess part of where the fear comes in is when people hear nuclear rocket, they think something like Project Orion, where you're taking a nuke and blowing it up underneath the vehicle over and over and over again. there's going to be a tremendous amount of fallout that's going to happen, and that would happen in that scenario. That happens, of course, inside our atmosphere. So you do have backscatter. So what do you propose in your plan?
Well, what my second book argues is that you use a nuclear rocket engine to take payloads to low Earth orbit, and then you bring that engine back and you reuse the non-nuclear rocket components, such as the turbopump and the nozzle and the pressure vessel, and you take the old core out and send it for recycling. Now, the way I see doing it is you start off with a small engine, not these very large systems that people were thinking about during the 1960s, but something small. And you build it so it can be carried in the cargo bay of, let's say, a C-5A or maybe a 747, or maybe you build a special plane for it. Well, you take it there, then you fly it out several thousand miles out to an isolated ocean area, and you push it out. Then you have two solid rocket boosters that take this stage up from roughly 30, 40, 50,000 feet. I mean, this is just a concept that I'm setting on the table for people to think about. The stage takes it up to over 100,000 feet, and then the nuclear engine fires and takes the payload up to low Earth orbit. Now, if there are no people, and there are no people several hundred or several thousand miles out, out in an isolated ocean area, there is very few people to get hurt. Second, the use of the solid rocket boosters does this, is it gives the aircraft time to get out of the way while the nuclear engine is coming up to power. And a nuclear rocket engine is different from a chemical rocket engine in that it takes 30 to 60 seconds for it to come up to full power. So while these 2 or 3 solids are carrying the stage up, the nuclear engine is coming up to power. It's going to reach full power somewhere above 100,000 feet, and above 100,000 feet, you are basically above the Earth's atmosphere. So all the neutrons and the gammas coming off are just going to go straight into space or straight into the atmosphere, where they will be treated like the gammas and neutrons that are coming from the deep solar system. They're all blocked by our atmosphere.
Can you compare that to, because that's actually a good point. There's a ton of radiation that doesn't make it down to Earth because of our atmosphere. And when you look at, this was actually measured at New Space, and I forgot the exact formula, but it's something along the lines of, if you're on Earth and that's 100% protection, when you're up on the ISS, that would only be 2% protection,
right,
based on the amount of atmosphere that's around there.
That one.
So when you're up there, how much radiation would we be giving off as compared to what's just naturally, because radiation is a natural occurrence. Right. It is nothing, just because we are making it doesn't mean that it's not something that is just naturally occurring.
Right.
I'm not quite certain I follow your question.
So how much more radiation would we be putting up above the atmosphere than is naturally there already?
That's like, well, not much.
So in reality, we wouldn't be able to perceive it at all here on Earth. In fact, it would be a controlled reaction, so we would know where it is, as opposed to space where we just don't know. The naturally occurring radiation, we don't know as much about that as opposed to the radiation that we create ourselves.
Right.
Well, the engine would run for 10, 12, maybe 15 minutes to reach low Earth orbit. Then it's shut off. So you are talking about a gamma and a neutron burden from, let's say, a very small engine lasting for that short of time, then it shuts off. Now, I further posit that you put this engine in what I call a cocoon, or it can be any number of structures. It can be, just something that you wrap around it because you want to bring it back and not leave it up in orbit. You would leave it up in orbit for a couple months for it to cool down, and then after it's cooled down, then you'd bring it back to Earth. And if it's in this protective cocoon, that is going to dampen much of the gammas and the neutrons that are still coming off from it.
Someone in the chat room would like to know, and this is actually a really good question, what's the cost difference between this system and a traditional just chemical rocket? Why would we want to do this system as opposed to chemical rockets? Well,
first off, you have much higher thrusting power. You are talking about a system that starts off at roughly 825 seconds, and I argue in my book that it looks like 1200 is the ceiling for the solid core. That's roughly 3 times better than your best chemical system. Also, at one time, very early on in the old rover nerve program, some were speculating 1600 seconds out of the solid core. And I've had some people speculate to me, really putting on their crystal ball sort of glasses and saying, well, 1800 seconds is the ceiling. So, the bottom line with those two things is no one knows what the ceiling is, but it's certainly much higher than a chemical rocket, which reached its ceiling back in the 1960s with liquid oxygen and hydrogen.
Well, it sounds to me like your entry-level rocket, just where you begin, already starts 3 times more efficient, or 3 times greater, I guess, than the chemical rockets we have today. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah.
So why aren't we doing this then?
Well, I think NASA, or certain parts of NASA, have a fair... Well, in 1960, the first head of NASA got into a big argument with the AEC over the scope and pace of the program. And in 1960, T. Keith Glennon said that NASA was only going to use a nuclear rocket engine from low Earth orbit going out into deep space where it could, quote, pose no harm toward Earth. The reason they did this was basically for PR, because back in 1960, you had massive worldwide protest against atmospheric testing, with hundreds of thousands of people marching here in the U.S. and in Europe. So they were sensitive. NASA was an agency just a couple years old, so he didn't want to have any of that bad PR. So he just said, we are only going to use it from low Earth orbit outward. Now, as a consequence, all of the mission studies that have been done basically since then have been focusing on using a nuclear rocket engine to take payloads from low Earth orbit going somewhere into the solar system where it would, quote, pose no harm to Earth. I think that's wrong. And at the time, the AEC thought it was wrong. Now, in my book, there is a quote by John Simpson. And for the audience who doesn't know who John Simpson is, well, in the atomic energy area, John Simpson is of equal stature to Wernher von Braun in the space field. So he was a very named person. And you took what he said back then seriously. And I have a quote from him which basically said, "We don't see any insurmountable technical problems in using a nuclear rocket engine to take payloads up into low Earth orbit." Now, from 1955 through 1960, there were any number of studies done on using a nuclear rocket engine in that mode, and I have them all in my second book. But what I'm postulating here is, look, we need to re-examine this, because if you do follow this launch sequence, you have a revolution in the economics of space. And as you lower your costs down to, let's say, $100 or so per pound, or even lower, then you are changing the space program from something that's government run into a private sector program, where each one of you can now have personal access to space. Now, Ben, you look like you weigh a couple 100 pounds. Well, at $100 per pound, it would cost you maybe $20,000 to go into space. That's still quite high.
A lot lower than what we got today, though.
Exactly.
Yeah, the Russians, I think in my book, I said they were 30 million, and someone said, no, they're 50 million now. Well,
they are, yep.
50 million is beyond what most people have to spend on a shot into space. $20,000, I could even do that.
That's absolutely doable, but how realistic is it? Let's just say someone had a blank check and just said, you know what, let's build this thing. Let's make this thing go with all the regulations in place and just the fear in the hearts and minds of everyone in the world, whether founded or unfounded. Is it a realistic plan? Will they actually let something like this get built? And if they did, how long would it take?
Well, from a technical point of view, the only thing that had to be done was to test out the stage, because you had any number of reactor tests. You had a couple prototype engine tests, but there was no real stage testing done, where you had the engine and your hydrogen tank here to test the. I'm having a senior moment again, and I can't think of it.
But the staging process itself, correct?
Yeah.
Right.
So all of the plans are there, and if you go back to what was proven and what has plenty of room for technological growth, you could probably do it in 5 or 6 years. But if you get some scientists and engineers coming and say, well, I've got this great idea, and we're going to we are going to do this and that, well, then you can probably talk 10, 12, 15 years. One of the hardest problems they had with the nuclear rocket back then is what would face anyone now, and that is, how do you keep the core inside the pressure vessel? And the reason why is simple. If this is your pressure vessel here, and your core is here, you have hydrogen gas that comes on the top of the core, and then in 52 inches, it comes in at very high pressure and at 0 centigrade, and then 52 inches later, it leaves the core at very low pressure and 2,000 or 3,000 C. Well, this pressure difference from high to low, in essence, creates a force which is trying to blow the core out the nozzle.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it took Los Alamos from 1955 through 1964 to come up with a core design that they knew that was going to stay inside the core, and that was the Kiwi B4 core design. And they went through dozens of these, and I have some of them listed in my first book, I'm a Nuclear Rocket Program. There was Old Black Joe and gosh, I can't think of the other ones now, but they all had colorful names. They did any number of studies. How do you keep the core inside the pressure vessel? First step.
Well, and the core seems to be the issue with a nuclear in general, isn't it? I mean, that's where you have things melting down and just creating massive amounts of pressure and blowing the tops off of things. I mean, that it seems like a logical problem, and you have to deal with zero G, right? So you've got this object that could float around anywhere if it wasn't totally stabilized, and then you got that massive pressure difference trying to force it out the back. That doesn't seem easy.
Well, first let's deal with the fear of an explosion. In both my books, I talk about what's known as the Kiwi TNT Test. The TNT stands for Transit Nuclear Test. And here they purposely rigged a full-scale 1,000 megawatt 35-inch core by 52 inches long. They rigged it to explode, and it was specially designed to do so. And I have pictures, and you can see it prior to the test. You can see the explosion coming from the test. Then you can see the aftermath, where they split the area up into 6 sectors. Then they went and picked up the pieces, but they first measured how far they were from ground zero and how much they weighed. And from that, they were able to calculate that the force of the explosion was equal to 200 to 300 pounds of black gunpowder. Now, the principal damage that was done is a trailer about 600-700 feet from ground zero suffered a couple broken windows. And there's a guy named Stan Gunn who's still living, and I hope he's watching. Stan helped found the program at Rocketdyne, and Stan went and picked up the pieces, and he said he got 10R from doing it, which is double the dose limit now, but Stan's 87.
Nice.
And he's still going strong. And if Stan is going to die, Stan's going to die in his 1960s Corvette, which he ramped up the horsepower, so he's getting something like 560 or 580 horsepower out of it. Stan is a turbo pump man, so he puts all these things on his engine.
I love it.
So let's just say we had done this in the 60s. And rather than continuing with chemical rockets, we decided, you know what? We are going to explore this. We're going to start to build it. Where do you, in your opinion, think we would be technologically today when it comes to space?
Well, at some point, even assuming the ban, if you had people using it starting in the late 1970s, you would probably have the fear of nukes in space drastically downgraded, and you would probably have now any number of systems using a nuclear rocket engine to push payloads into space. So I think you would have probably very, very large space stations, much larger than the 440-ton ISS. I mean, I mentioned earlier the study that Rocketdyne did in 1968 that said if you just take a first-generation NERVA and you put it on the Saturn V as the third stage, and you double the boosting power from 250,000 to 500,000 pounds. Well, that's 250 tons.
I mean,
Space station weighs 440. I mean,
what about to the moon? Would we be able to go back to the moon, onto Mars? Would we be able to do more human space flight from using this technology? Or would we still be kind of stuck in the, basically, will it lower the cost and make space travel that much easier to do?
Well, what it would do is it would force, in my view, and this is what I write in my second book, it would force a restructuring of the space program, so you would have a much broader and much deeper private sector space program. And they would come up with the funding. And so you would have the shift. So NASA would still have certain types of duties, but it would sort of change into being something like the FAA, where it does airline safety R&D, and you have different groups that regulate the airline industry. I mean, NASA now is an operational entity, plus doing, you know, research in other areas. So you know, you would find a basic shift from a public sector space program to a private sector space program. And once you have the private sector funding it, well, it's going to fund what it wants to fund.
All right. I'm just checking the chat room just to see if there's anything, any final comments. Where can people get more information about you and your projects online? I got you with that one.
No, there's nuclearspace.com is my understanding.
Pardon?
Nuclearspace.com.
That's a website, and they have very active people who talk about various types of nuke issues. But I don't have a website. I've got too many irons in the fire.
But people can pick up your book, The Nuclear Rocket, through Apogee Books. It's right here. We actually do have a copy to give away, and we'll do that at the end of the show. If you're able to stick around a little bit longer, I'd like to ask you a few questions that were brought up in the chat room, comparing it to other technologies. But for now, we'll wrap up this show, and I wanted to thank you for joining us so much. It was like I said, this is one of those things we need to explore if we really, truly want to go out to the stars. We can't continue to rely on chemical rockets. They just... We've hit the maximum that we can do with those, unless we're going to build another Saturn V or Ares V that are these towering monstrosities that are nothing but fuel.
Right.
That's right. I mean, you were talking about 80 to 90% of a chemical rocket on the launch pad is just fuel and oxidizer, and the rest is your the weight of your tanks, your engine, your nozzles. Then after you take all of that out, what's left is your payload. And in a general rule, or as a general rule from a practical point of view, it's around 1 to 2%.
So James, stay with us. We'll come back to you in just a few minutes.
Okay.
For everyone else joining us live, let's see here. What are we doing for I forgot what the contest was. We were doing someone who had pre-tweeted the show as the winner. So we've already got a winner of the. By the way, this isn't just a copy of James' book, but it's actually a signed copy. And unlike last week, it's already signed. So we're set on that one. So how did you want to do this? I'll go like that.
Perfect.
And be the Justin.
Be the Justin.
Be the Justin. Congratulations! Yay. You've won a copy of James Dewar's The Nuclear Rocket. So we'll get that out to you. For everyone else, we're going to go into post-show in just a minute. If you don't have a copy of Spacevidcast Epic, pick that up. You can watch the post-show on demand. And if you don't have a copy of Spacevidcast Epic, you're going to want to grab that because we have videos going up from the New Space Conference of the lunches and dinners that were not made available. You had to actually be at the lunch or dinner. There was no live stream of it. And the only other way you can watch it is through Spacevidcast Epic, and it's the entire lunch or dinner. In fact, the SEDS, we've even got the SEDS ISU video going up a little bit later on tonight. Yep. That's like over 2 hours. That one video alone is over 2 hours. That's 2.5 gigs.
That was a crazy dinner. It was very, very
It was really cool. It had DJ Dr. P in it. It had from Bob Richards, and then it had from hold, stall for me. National Space Society, name is blanking here. Anybody?
I can't remember to save my life. Isn't
that
right. terrible?
Well, I'm not going to delay the whole thing anyhow, but it was an awesome presentation. We've also got Laser Motive's speech online right now through Spacevidcast Epic, and we've got 2 more going online that are Epic only. And of course, you get the ad-free experience, and you help us go to other conferences, such as Space Up DC. We're about an 85% go on that one right now. And other stuff like that, because we like to bring you coverage. And again, I did want to thank the Space Frontier Foundation for the awesome award. It's pretty epic. It's heavy.
It's like 4.5 pounds.
It is. This has got some weight.
They said we can send it to you. We said no, it's okay. We'll pack it. We were like, oh, hey, we're over.
So we packed it in our luggage, and then we went to leave, and they're like, yeah, no, you're going to need to move some stuff out of this. And we're like, What? What are you
Yeah.
talking about?
Oh,
It's
that
the
was-
same. Oh, the big heavy award.
The big heavy thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next week.
In 1969,